Uriah is going to be on shortly. There she is. Hi there, Uriah.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Uriah.
Excellent. Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's webinar. Today, we take a break from our regular Dream Destination series and take a dive into the world of travel insurance, one of those items that's certainly worth considering when planning those big international trips. So today we're being joined by Uriah Jansen, who's the Managing Director at Oojah Travel Protection and a leading expert in travel insurance. She manages Oojah's travel insurance portfolio, which is underwritten by the Hollard Group. Oojah Travel Protection started in 2010 and administers travel insurance for all of Hollard's licenses. Uriah's career kicked off with South African Airways back in 1988. In 2000, she then moved into the travel insurance industry, where she's been specializing for the last 20 years. Notable is the fact that Uriah has been instrumental in establishing Oojah Travel Protection, creating a new standard in the way travel insurance is being sold by establishing a user-friendly website and easy to understand products, which for any of us who have delved into the world of insurance and travel insurance before, an easy to understand product is always highly welcomed. So before I hand over to Uriah, I just wanted to mention that as usual, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, please pop those into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen or else in the chat function. And that's it from me. Over to you, Uriah. The virtual floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to explain travel insurance to you. I'm obviously not the expert on birding, but I do hope to be the expert on travel insurance and hopefully answer all your questions and be able to keep you interested in the explanation of travel insurance. Firstly, I want to start just with a disclaimer. A lot of the terms I'm explaining, I'm going to start with a general explanation. I believe it's important for most of the people that want to look at travel insurance is to understand some of the terms that we're using. And for that, I'm just going to go into some general details or explanations on insurance terms. But a lot of it is also referring to specifically, we are operating in the South African and African market. So it's always important that when you do look at your own travel insurance, that you look at your policy wording that is applicable to your cover. I will try and highlight certain items that you must always look at when you are considering travel insurance. And then afterwards, when we do the Q&A, if there's any specific questions and I can assist and answer, I will do that to the best of my abilities. So if we can go into or jump into just the general side of it, what is insurance? And I think this is a general concept and most people understand it. I just wanted to highlight the term. But it's basically where you take a risk and you spread it amongst a large group of people so that you can protect yourself against a loss. And usually you then have a small insurance payment. And the reason why I've got this highlighted is to highlight the fact that it has to be a large group of people to ensure that your insurance premium remains low. Because you can imagine if you only have 10 people that want insurance, that will drive the premium up and create higher insurance premiums. Insurance, obviously, from an insurer's point of view, only works if most of the group goes without a loss. And I know a lot of people always feel that, you know, insurers don't pay out claims. That's not true. That's why I said most of the group don't have a loss or goes without a loss. But we do. We pay lots of claims. And specifically on travel insurance, when I explain some of the benefits to you later on, you know, some of our largest losses come from medical claims, where the exposures on medical claims are quite significant and large amounts that we are paying. I try to bring in reference to birds and birding, there are some birds that I've been told are risk-taking birds. I don't know if you can identify the ones on your screen. But the first one is the black-necked crane, and apparently they migrate right over the Himalayas. So if they had to contact us for travel insurance for their migration, I'm not so sure whether we would want to underwrite their risk. But depending, you know, maybe they're strong birds and it doesn't take them too long. So there's a lot of factors that you have to consider when you do look at it. And the other type of a bird that takes a risk is the Arctic tern, and they migrate all the way from the Southern Ocean to the Arctic Circle to breed. So back to insurance terms, and I want to highlight the terms here and just explain them again so that when I do refer to the travel insurance side of it, you fully understand. But the first term that we're using in insurance is what we refer to as a peril. And a peril is just a specific risk or cause of loss that is covered by an insurance policy. So for example, you've got a motor insurance policy will cover, for example, an accident. So that will be an insured peril, or theft of your motor vehicle. And then if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, there's a lot of the perils highlighted on there. That's typical to an insurance policy. So this is generally the bad thing that can happen to you, or the danger that can happen to either you or your stuff, or your place, your house, your car, your personal baggage if you're going on a trip and the baggage gets stolen, theft of that, damage to it. Those are perils. I've already mentioned, but specifically if we're looking at perils in terms of a travel insurance policy, we'll always refer to something like unexpected illness or injury, or the mechanical breakdown of an aircraft, specifically when you have a delay claim. So your flight was supposed to depart at 10 a.m. and whilst you're sitting at the airport, you get an announcement and they say to you, oh, so sorry, the flight has been delayed for 7 hours due to a mechanical breakdown. So while the flight is delayed, you now have to pay for food, perhaps even book into accommodation to spend the night, and then the flight still departs, but it departs a bit later. On this point, I want to highlight, because I'm not going into too much detail on the delay side of the claims, but perhaps just to highlight that there's a difference between a mechanical delay and an operational delay. And this is, I think not a lot of travelers always understand the reason why, but in travel insurance policies, we cover a mechanical breakdown of the aircraft, for example. So a part is broken and they need to fix it. But we also have delays, what they refer to as operational delays, and this is typically within the control of the airline. So it could be due to shortage of crew, or they have a problem refueling, they're waiting for fuel, but it's generally due to their planning and their organization of the airline, their schedules. So a policy will cover, the travel insurance policy will cover the mechanical breakdown of the delay. But if it's operational, the airline is supposed to reimburse you because they at fault. It was within their control. Just to highlight that for you. Other examples of perils on a travel insurance policy would include unexpected strike and even adverse weather conditions. I know a lot of times of the year, in the winter months, there's a snowstorm and the flights are all delayed. So those are typical perils that would be covered in a travel insurance policy. So if we then say we understand the term peril, we then also have to understand that there's something that we refer to as a named peril. So a named peril would be what is listed. It's specifically written into your policy wording to say that if this happens to you, we will pay a claim. So as I've mentioned with the mechanical breakdown of the aircraft, if there's a mechanical breakdown of the aircraft and your flight is delayed, for example, 6 hours or more, we will reimburse you for food and accommodation that you had to pay for whilst you are waiting for your flight to depart. So those would be your typical named perils. Important to understand that if they are not listed in your policy, they are not covered. A lot of times clients actually say to us, but your policy doesn't say anything about operational, so how can you exclude that? Well, our policy says we cover mechanical breakdown. That is the named peril. So it's silent on what we don't cover. And if it's silent or not listed, specifically written in the policy or on the schedule, then that will not be covered in your travel insurance policy. So it's important to always go and look either on the schedule of benefits or take the time to read through the terms and conditions, the policy wording, to see under each benefit, what is the listed perils that you are covered for? Travel insurance is quite general across the world, but there are small differences depending on in which country you're buying it and who's the insurer. They could change something very small, or there could be a difference. So it's important that you understand that. And I know policy wordings, I don't even always read the policy wordings, but it's worth your while, because when you have to claim, that's actually where we find out that now all of a sudden somebody has gone to read the policy wording and they realize something is not covered. And then the client is unhappy because we're unable to meet their expectations. We also have what we refer to as an uninsurable risk. And this is something that is now quite pertinent, specifically with the COVID-19 situation. I'm not saying there is no cover for COVID, but there are certain elements within that we deem as an uninsurable risk. So an uninsurable risk is a danger that you cannot get insurance for it generally. And there's a reason for it. It's not just because we don't want to provide cover, but when we calculate to determine if we can provide cover, we determine and say, okay, what is the chance of something happening? So again, if I can go back to a travel delay, there is a chance of a travel delay happening, but if you look on a per day basis, the thousands of flights that are departing, the percentage of those flights that will be delayed ultimately is relatively low. So therefore, a travel delay is still something that we can provide cover for. Or it could be where we say, even if it doesn't have a high chance of happening, the cost to purchase this insurance. So if we have to calculate how much it will cost for us to provide cover for that benefit, it's going to be so expensive that you in any way cannot purchase the cover. And then we will make a decision to say something is an insurable risk or it's an unsurable risk, to try and keep that balance in keeping the premiums as low as possible, but also provide cover for the benefits that we see as it doesn't have a chance of happening exactly every day. There's a small chance of it happening. So for example, on an uninsurable risk, to people that are terminally ill, they cannot buy life insurance because it's already a known event. They already have an illness, they've already been diagnosed, so then you can't buy the insurance anymore, life cover. If you're looking at travel insurance, what we deem to be uninsurable risks, specifically to COVID-19, there's a lot of countries, and I must be honest, we need to check this almost on a daily basis as to which country is saying what are the entry requirements, what do you need to do, etc. But for example, where the country says that you need to be quarantined when you arrive in that country. So you already know that upfront, that when I arrive in, for example, Mauritius, they've currently got a 2-week quarantine period if they do allow you to travel there. So that is part of their entry requirements. Travel insurance cannot provide cover for something that's already known. So for us, that's an uninsurable peril. We're not going to cover that. And I'll get into more detail as to exactly what are the different types of things that we can cover relating to COVID-19, because I do think that that's a top of mind right now. Another risk that we deem to be an uninsurable risk, from our side, for example, our age limit on our policies is 81 years. Some policies can go up to 90 years, depending on the insurance company. And again, they would have calculated their appetite for risk in terms of the chance of it happening and how expensive it is. And I want to explain the age limit as well, because I do feel that senior travelers in general need to understand that for us, the risk, the older you get, if somebody is young and you fall, for example, whilst you're walking on a tour, whilst overseas, you might get a bruise or you might break your leg and you get a cast and you're fine. But the older you get, the higher the risk of complications, the higher the risk of having to be hospitalized in ICU. And we've got case studies of claims that we have paid. And generally, those type of claims, we're looking at a minimum of $100,000 US to treat somebody that's just fallen, because it could be a broken hip versus just a quick recovery for somebody else. if I try and bring it back to the birding community, some birds that we would probably, if they had to knock on our door and say, can we have insurance, what could be deemed as uninsurable birds? The emperor penguin, I'm sure most of you recognized it. They are beautiful, but you know, they don't move away from a harsh conditions in Antarctica with their brutal conditions to live and raise their young. I'm not going to go through the list of the birds at the bottom. Maybe you can spot them and see if you can recognize them. I've got the names on there for you. I'm probably scared that I'm not going to pronounce them correctly. But they migrate to get from Europe down into Africa, and they fly over, you know, land zones like Malta and Middle Eastern countries, etc. So it's quite a risk that they are taking. And again, if we had to provide insurance for birds, we would probably say to them that you're an uninsurable risk. But we would get more info from them as well on how strong they are, how regular, you know, what happens during their trip, etc. But I just thought it's interesting to also understand that could happen in the bird life. The next term that I want to explain to you before we get to the actual travel insurance side is what we refer to as proximate cause. Now, a proximate cause is where we determine how the actual loss or damage happened and whether this is a result of an insured peril. And I know this might seem quite obvious to say, well, my flight was delayed, so therefore it's an insured peril pay. But as I've explained already, was your flight delayed due to mechanical reasons or operational reasons? Because mechanical reasons is covered, operational not. So the proximate cause needs to be determined. And we refer to that as the direct cause. And I'll go into more detail with that as well, because that's also sometimes, specifically when you travel, there could be a number of events that happen that ultimately lead to the loss. And then we have to say, what was the sequence of events and what was the final outcome? Specifically also, if we now look at COVID-19, if you remember early in March from our side, that's when most of the travel restrictions were put in place and lockdowns happened, etc. So specifically from our point of view, COVID actually started, I think, November, December last year. The first cases of COVID was already identified in China. Then the World Health Organization announced that it's a pandemic in January, end of January or February. So COVID was already there, but then the lockdown and the travel restrictions started. Now you have to determine and say, well, what was the sequence of events? So for example, if my flight was canceled, was it canceled due to COVID or was it canceled due to a travel restriction? And that's where we then have to determine, and it becomes a bit more complicated. It's not just a clear-cut case of, well, your flight was canceled and therefore it's a covered claim. And that's why when we sometimes ask for supporting documents or for explanations, it's because we are trying to determine the proximate cause of the loss. This is just as a funny, I don't think they really, but if you really think about September 11, if you look at proximate cause, if you take it all the way back, who invented flying, the Wright brothers, you can probably blame them then for September 11. But as mentioned already, it's not that simple, because it's not because of the Wright brothers, but because of other reasons. And there was a break in events. And therefore, the proximate cause of 9/11 was not linked directly to the Wright brothers. Why do we need a proximate cause? As you can see in that little cartoon there, the lady is telling the insurance claims assessor that her clothing and her wardrobe in her bedroom got destroyed because there was a fire in the kitchen. So, you know, from a claims insurance point of view, we need to determine what is the proximate cause, because if it's not an insured peril, then the claim will be rejected. Then it's not a covered claim. And therefore, the claims assessor needs to establish the chain of events to decide whether the claim is payable or not. Just an example on one of the case studies that we have is, if a man falls from a ladder, let's say he was painting his house, and he's then taken to hospital. So he's broken his leg, he goes to hospital, but in the hospital, he contracts cholera from the patient in the next bed, and then he dies. how would we determine the proximate cause of death? Because he wouldn't have been in the hospital had it not been for him falling from the ladder. But then he contracted cholera and he died. And this is actually a legal case study that we've had in terms of how the courts view proximate cause. And in this case, they said that not everybody that falls from a ladder and breaks their leg ends up getting cholera. So therefore, the fall from the ladder is a separate event. He was unlucky, yes, whilst in hospital, the patient next to him had cholera and he contracted it and therefore he passed away. But there was a break in events, and you can't then say that the fall from the ladder was the proximate cause of death. So in this case, cholera would have been deemed to be the cause of death. And specifically when you've got personal accident policies, they will only cover you for injury, not for illness. So in this case, the policy would not have covered him because the fall was, the cause of death was not because of the accident or the injury. It was because of an illness that he got whilst in hospital. Unfortunately, all insurance policies do have exclusions. And that again goes hand in hand with the risk premium, the premium that we are charging. There will be exclusions attached to it. And when you are looking at a proximate cause, if you have something where we say, we cover you, this is the insured peril or the named peril, but there is also an exclusion. If there's an exclusion, for instance, in this case, you can see his flight was cancelled and the policy has an exclusion that's specifically written. And to be clear, it has to be written in the policy. So this is not like named perils where it can be silent. An exclusion must be specifically written, but the policy says that we do not cover claims due to the cancellation by the airline. So the loss resulted from the flight cancelled by the airline. So even though the named peril is cancelled flights, but if it's cancelled by the airline, it's not covered, the policy will then, the exclusion trumps the decision on the claim, and the claim will then be rejected. If we then move on to travel insurance, what is travel insurance? Well, it can cover you, for example, for cancellation before your trip. So it's to protect your financial investment. All the amounts that you pay before you go on holiday for flights and accommodation, etc. And then once your trip starts, to cover you for unforeseen events whilst you are on your trip. So that's typically what travel insurance is. What travel insurance is not, and I think this is also important to highlight, is that it's not a medical aid. So it does not operate under a medical scheme license or a medical aid license. The intention of travel insurance, if you, for instance, fall ill overseas, is not to provide ongoing treatment until you are now 100% healthy again. The purpose or the intention of travel insurance is to stabilize and then to repatriate you. And repatriate takes you back to your home country. So typically we could have somebody that is not fully recovered, but we get a fit to fly. So we always communicate with the treating doctor, and the treating doctor will say, well, we've got a fit to fly, and the fit to fly can have certain conditions attached to it. If it's a fit to fly where the person is still in a serious condition, but he is stable enough, they might say to us, it's an air ambulance. So then we have to charter an air ambulance with medical personnel to go and fetch that person and bring them back home. Or it could be a fit to fly where they confirm and they say, you are fit to fly, however, it can be on a commercial flight, meaning as a passenger on the aircraft. And then depending on your condition, the doctor could either specify whether you need to be upgraded to business class, for example, or whether it's okay to remain in economy if your original ticket was in economy. Typically, an upgrade to business class will happen where you've broken your leg and you need extra leg room to keep your leg elevated for the full flight. Or they could even say it's a commercial flight with a medical escort. So then we will also pay for the person to accompany you on the flight back to your home country. Terms and conditions, as mentioned, unfortunately, there are exclusions. There are conditions that you have to comply with. And a policy is not just a blanket policy that will cover everything. And therefore, it's important to always read your policy wording. You've got, for example, as I've mentioned, you've got a named peril like unexpected illness. An exclusion would be a pre-existing medical condition. On our policy specifically, we actually ask that clients declare their medical conditions to us upfront so that we can, in writing, confirm to them, yes, you've got cover, or no, you don't have cover, because we don't want a situation where something happens and you are in ICU with millions of dollars of expenses incurred, and then we try and figure out, should this be covered or not? So we want to do that underwriting up front and provide the client with the clarity that he's definitely covered for that medical condition. A lot of policies have it written into the terms and conditions on like a 50 or 60 page policy document. And if you don't see that you had to declare it, you could be in big trouble. So this is always something that you should ask for as well. You know, if you know you've got pre-existing medical conditions, be it where you actually just have high blood pressure, or it could even be diabetes, declare the information to your insurer so that they can give you in writing confirmation that it's covered. So if you didn't declare it with us, for example, then the exclusion would apply if something happens due to that pre-existing medical condition. Then we also have conditions of cover. So there's certain things we expect you to do. One of those things would be that you have to contact us so that we can authorize inpatient treatment. And there's a reason why you have to contact us to authorize inpatient treatment. When you are hospitalized in a hospital, we have our medical director that can speak to your treating doctor to, number one, make sure, is the treatment that they are providing appropriate? And when do they believe you will be stable enough for repatriation? And then obviously we also manage the costs. And if we don't get that opportunity to manage that, then we were prejudiced in the claim itself. And it's important to understand, I know we all love our doctors or our medical practitioners, but there's certain instances, you know, when you go snow skiing, for example, in Europe, and I'm going to say this in a general context of my personal experience with clients that we've had. There's certain ski resorts where the doctors there basically only work during the ski season. So if you break your leg, they want to operate rather than just putting it in a cast and giving you a fit to fly to go back to your home country. And the personal experience is my one business associate went skiing with us, and he actually did. We went tobogganing down the mountain, and he's also quite a tall guy, and he put his foot out and his foot hit a rock under the snow that he couldn't see. So he limped off the mountain and he said to us, no, I think I tore a muscle, or, you know, it's a sprain, not too bad. But the next morning he couldn't walk at all. And when he saw the doctor at the ski resort, he actually fractured his leg, his ankle. And that doctor did want to operate immediately, but you know, he at least understood insurance as well. And he asked the doctor, is there a way he can just, you know, put a cast on, get back to his home country and see his own private doctor. And finally, the doctor agreed. When he got back to his home country, the break was so clean that they did not have to operate. He just had to wear a moon boot for 6 weeks. And that was just an example of, we can never override a medical decision. I think I need to clarify that as well. If the treating doctor says this is what needs to happen and there is no other way, then we have to abide by that. But there are certain cases where we have experienced in the past where we need to have a conversation with the doctor to say, please tell us why this person is not fit to travel, for example. Who qualifies for the cover? I think it's important to highlight again that if you must be a resident, so from our policy point of view, and I've seen some of the questions that's come through as well, just because you can buy insurance on the internet does not mean that you necessarily qualify for it. So from a South African or an African legislation point of view, where we are selling our products, you actually have to be a resident of that country to qualify for the insurance. So if you are, for instance, a US citizen and you are traveling to the United Kingdom, to Europe, you cannot buy our insurance because our country, South Africa, or any of our other African licenses, we're not involved in the sales process at all. There's no insurable interest in this path. So even though you can buy it online via our website, it does not mean you actually qualify for the cover. So you should always check with, firstly, for an insurer from your own country, because also remember, specifically in our case as well, if there's a dispute on a claim and you want to follow a legal path to resolve the dispute, each country's got their own rules and own protection. So for South African citizens or residents, that we have an ombudsman, and they can lodge a complaint against us to say, well, we've rejected their claim, they don't agree, and then they get to have an independent person helping them to say, were we fair in the rejection or not? So to have that legal protection, it's always important that you check with whoever you're buying from, what does the policy wording say, who qualifies for the cover? Another important point on our policy specifically, again, it could change depending on which insurer you use, is that you must be in possession of a return ticket. A lot of people travel for immigration purposes, or they go and work in another country on a permanent basis. It does not mean there's no cover for them. We do have other expat policies as well, but typical travel insurance, this is not intended for people traveling on that type of a ticket. The third point might seem quite obvious. You must be healthy and fit to travel. But, you know, even I've been guilty where in the past, I think before COVID-19, if you had flu symptoms, you know, you would take your medication and still continue with your trip. And then if anything happens to you whilst on your trip, you know, depending on the severity and the type of condition, you could have problems when you submit your claim. Also very important is that cover cannot be anti-selective. We have a lot of clients that contact us to say, well, I'm going overseas for 6 months. I only need cover for the last month because the first 5 months I'm either staying with my children or I've got other cover in place. So I only want a policy from you for the last month. We don't provide cover on an anti-selective basis. It has to be from the date of departure from your home country. What are the main benefits of a travel insurance policy? A lot of times, you know, travel insurance is it's not a complicated type of insurance, but it's complex because it's got so many benefits. So one of the benefits, or the main, I would say the main purpose of travel insurance, where we pay also the largest currency amount in terms of claims that we pay, is for overseas medical expenses. And then the added benefits or the added value is your cancellation and curtailment, the financial investment that you are trying to protect, and then your out-of-pocket expenses, your travel delays, misconnections, personal baggage, either loss or theft of the baggage, personal liability. So this is typically if you do go snow skiing somewhere and you ski into another person and then they sue you because they have now suffered trauma and pain, and then that could be a benefit under the liability policy. And then personal accident is typically your death or your permanent disability lump sum cover. And to understand personal accident is if you pass away or you die due to an illness, let's assume you had a heart attack, the personal accident benefit will not pay. This has to be due to an accident. So where the aircraft, if there's an aircraft crash and the person dies as a result of that, that will then be covered under the personal accident policy. Last year, we had 2 clients in Indonesia that was on they went for the day on a little boat cruise, and all of a sudden the weather became quite nasty, and as they were trying to make their way back to land, and it was actually on media, the actual video of how the boat just short of land, the waves were just so incredibly high that it capsized and both of them drowned. So we then paid to repatriate the mortal remains as well as the personal accident benefit because that was death due to an accident. When should I buy my travel insurance? You can buy your travel insurance literally, you can, just a minute before you depart. But that's not the right thing to do because there's a cancellation benefit attached to travel insurance. So you should actually buy your travel insurance within 24 hours of paying your trip deposit. I'm going to talk about the cancel for any reason benefit just now. But you also need to check with each insurer. On our policy specifically, if you want to qualify for the cancel for any reason benefit, you have to purchase your insurance within 24 hours, because if you buy it later, it almost becomes anti-selective. But it can vary. Some companies say 24 hours, some say 48 hours, some will give you a week, but there is definitely a cut-off time. So the sooner you buy it, the better for your own financial investment. And note that this has to be purchased within 24 hours of your trip deposit. So a lot of times you will book something and they'll tell you, okay, you have to pay a certain amount immediately to secure your trip. And then 30 days before departure, pay the remainder. You have to buy your travel insurance within 24 hours of paying the first payment, the initial payment. There are some rules, and these rules apply to you as the traveler, as the insured person. So firstly, you have to phone us, and I specifically put the photo there of the lady, the nurse, next to the telephone. You have to phone us. Don't email us. Don't send us a WhatsApp. Phone us, because we've got a 24-hour assistance line, and we have to authorize the expenses. I cannot tell you about the amount of claims that we receive in excess of $1,000, and sometimes even as high, you know, clearly travelers still have a lot of money where they pay tens of thousands of dollars. They pay the hospital, they come back to their home country, and then they submit a claim. We weren't aware of the case. We weren't allowed the opportunity to manage the expenses, to manage whether we could repatriate you, the treatment that was provided. So very, very important. Phone. If you are unconscious, obviously, we will understand, and then we will make a decision based on the situation at that point. But if you're not unconscious, then you need to make sure you get somebody to phone us so that we can authorize the expenses. Bring back damaged property. Again, we have a lot of baggage claims where the airline has damaged your baggage, and then the client gets to the other side and they throw away the suitcase and they just buy a new suitcase, and then they come back and they submit a claim. And then we say, well, at least that you take a photo of the property. So always make sure that you, as a minimum, take a photo of the damaged property. But they didn't even do that. They just threw it away. So there's no evidence of the loss. They didn't report it to the airline, and they just expect us to pay the claim. And we want to pay the claim, but we need the supporting evidence. So you need to bring back the damaged property or take a photo, and at that point phone us and say, I've taken a photo, I can send it to you, you can have a look at it. I'm not going to drag this suitcase around for 5 weeks on the rest of my trip. Can I now throw it away? But get permission before you do that. I've explained already, you need to buy your policy within a certain amount of hours or days to qualify for the cancellation benefits. Something obvious, but it doesn't happen, is when you actually cancel your trip, cancel your flights with the airline and cancel your accommodation with the accommodation provider. The longer you take to notify those parties that you are no longer going on the trip, the higher the cancellation fees will be. And we could be prejudiced in saying, well, if you canceled your trip within 30 days, X amount would have applied for your cancellation. But because you only canceled it a week before departure, so we will only pay you for what would have applied had you canceled it at the time you knew you needed to cancel your trip. Check in for your flight or cruise on time. Again, this seems obvious, but when you're in a foreign country, you don't always understand traffic, difficulties getting to the airport, that when you get to your flight, the flight, specifically for people that's not regular travelers, they think they can get to the airport a minute before the departure time, and that's fine. There's time limits to it, and I think now with COVID-19, where they might start doing tests before you get onto your flight, etc., make sure you get to your airport or your cruise terminal in time to check in for your flight. Again, if you've got a claim, you need to complete a claim form, and very, very important is the supporting documents. I've already mentioned a couple of those supporting documents that you need to provide when you're submitting a claim. If a loss has been due to an airline's fault, for example, where the airline has lost your baggage or the airline has damaged your baggage, you have to, number one, On travel insurance, we don't have the ability to send a claims assessor to each and every airline, to each and every airport, to go and talk to them and say, Mr. X says his bag was damaged. Can you confirm yes or no? Can you actually remember it? Yes or no? So the only evidence that we have that this was, as you said, the airline damaged your baggage is for you to get a report from the airline to confirm. So that is what we refer to as a property irregularity report. So don't leave the airport until you have a property irregularity report. A lot of times the clients will also tell us, but the airline said to us, they don't issue a property irregularity report. That's not true. It's their legal obligation. They have to issue you with that property irregularity report. Then because the airline was at fault, so they've damaged your bag, so they then need to say, well, in their conditions of carriage, do they cover damaged bags? And if they do, it's usually a small amount, but they still have to confirm that. So let's say your bag was $1,000. The airline says they'll cover $100 because that's what the conditions of carriage says. Your policy will then cover the difference, the $900. But you have to claim from the airline first. I've already discussed that you have to declare your medical information to the insurer or any information that we as the insurer will not know. So if you are going to a remote location somewhere in Africa on one of your birding adventures, tell your insurance company, I am going to country X. There's probably no medical facilities. We're going to be in the middle of the bush. And will you provide cover for that? Make sure you disclose that information. And then they can confirm in writing, yes, no problem. We have an assistance company that understand the situation in Africa. We can get you from a remote location and evacuate you to the nearest medical facility, and it's included in your policy. So that's always very important to know. If, for instance, you are traveling somewhere and somebody has stolen any of your items, make sure that you actually do report this to the police and get a police report. Again, that's the only evidence to verify your version of events. When you travel, I always say when I get to the airport, my brain changes. I go into a different mode, and where I'm usually, I always look after my stuff. All of a sudden, I forget my stuff all over the place. You need to understand that if you're in a foreign country and you leave your bag on one side to go take photos on another area, and when you turn around, the bag is gone. That will not be covered because you left your items unattended in a place that the public has got access to it. So please make sure that if you're traveling with somebody else, you tell them, here's my bag, hold on to it, I'm going to take a photo. Or unfortunately, you take the bag with you. Never ever. There's syndicates operating internationally that can spot and can see you're a tourist, sorry, you're distracted, and they will target you. Valuable items is very important. Things that we consider, and each policy will have a different definition, but typically your laptops, your cell phones, jewelry, cash, don't check these items into your luggage before you fly. Again, we get so many claims where they say, I've checked my jewelry, my ring that I inherited from my mother, it was in my bag, it had a lock on, but when it got to the other side, the lock was broken and it's stolen. It's not covered. You have to carry valuable items and cash on your person, or if you are staying in a hotel or a lodge, lock it in the safety deposit box in the room. Most hotel rooms have got the safety deposit box. If you're quickly going for dinner and you're going to leave your room, you cannot trust anybody. You can't trust the cleaners, nobody. You should not leave your items lying around. Obviously, there's also certain countries that each policy, and again, each policy is different. On our policy specifically, we follow the travel advice from the British and Commonwealth, the FCO. They've got a website that you can click on, and then they will tell you whether there's any travel restrictions relating to a specific country. And sometimes not the whole country is excluded, but it could be that a portion of the country is excluded. So if you are traveling up in Africa, into Northern Africa, for example, if you go anywhere near the Syrian border, that won't be covered, but the rest of a country neighboring Syria could be covered. But again, make sure you check. But each policy follows a different travel advice. I know the US have got their own travel advice for their own travelers when they also leave to say, when you go to a specific country, please be careful, please note that. So apart from the list of countries that is listed on typical travel advice from the governments, it's also where a government has announced a state of emergency, and we've had to add the last part of this sentence with COVID-19 that was now announced as a pandemic. So it's with the exception of emergencies relating to medical pandemics or emergencies. So this would typically be where there's civil unrest and they would announce a state of emergency. Because before COVID, to be quite honest, countries that had a state of emergency was where it was war-torn countries. And now almost the whole world has got a travel advice to say, don't travel to that country, but due to high infection rates due to COVID. So that's not necessarily excluded, but again, please declare it to your insurer to say, I am traveling to country B. Please confirm, COVID, because they've got a high rise in infections, or they might not, but make sure that they say to you in writing that they will cover you for travel to that country. And then the last one, I think, goes hand in hand, where there might be civil unrest, etc., but where the United Nations Armed Forces are present and active. We also cannot provide cover if you travel to those countries. Just to bring it back a bit again to the birding life, I must say the picture of the, I'm going to try and pronounce the name, but the mannequin, the Araripi mannequin, it's a beautiful bird, and the rented, but they would typically be birds that we would be happy to insure because they don't take huge risks and they don't migrate or move far. So on travel insurance, generally what is excluded, again, this is just a summary. You would need to check each policy specifically, but the most important ones is, if we're now looking at COVID-19, I've already mentioned, elective. So if you are traveling to a country where they say to you, when you arrive in that country, you will be quarantined for 2 weeks, that's excluded. If, however, you arrive in that country, it's not a travel requirement to be quarantined, but you've got symptoms and they test you at the airport and you test positive, we will then pay for your quarantine or for your inpatient treatment. But where there's no positive test, that won't be covered. Alcohol and drugs, I know a lot of times when you travel overseas, not necessarily, I don't know, I'm not going to comment on drugs, but alcohol specifically, you want to have a few cocktails, etc. If you then walk down the path to your room and you're over the alcohol limit, and depending on each country, they've got a specific limit, and you fall and you break your leg, your claim could be excluded. Where the airline has cancelled your flight. So this again brings me to the COVID-19 and the travel restrictions that happened earlier this year. Cancellation cover on a travel insurance policy, and I'll get into more detail a bit later on, but it's specifically where the person cancelled my trip. Where the airline cancelled your flight, they have contractually not provided you with what they said they will. They said they're going to fly you from point A to point B. So if they can't do that, they have to give you back your money. And I know that there's been a lot of situations where the airlines, and I don't blame them, to be honest. I'm trying to play neutral here because I think everybody's trying to survive, but they are offering vouchers, etc., to say, well, if you use them in a year's time, there won't be any penalties, etc. And for most of the clients, the vouchers work. But for some clients, they say, well, that I was going to attend a specific event. That event is not going to happen again. So therefore, I'm not going to use your voucher. And then the airline should actually give the money back. Some of the exclusions, obviously like a criminal act, we're not going to cover you if you're doing anything like that. If the airline denies boarding, again, they will only deny boarding if technically it's due to you not complying with regulations. So let's say you're supposed to have a Schengen visa when you travel to Europe, and the airline didn't check it, or when they check it at a time of departure, they see you don't have the visa and they deny boarding. that is typically something that won't be covered by your travel insurance policy. Employment, if you are flying as the pilot of the aircraft or the crew on the ship, those type of policies have very specific policies that you purchase through Lloyd's of London, for example, that won't be covered under a typical travel insurance policy. And then sporting events. We've got about 101 types of sporting events or activities that we automatically cover in our policy, but it's important that you also check for your policy, do they have a list? If they don't have a list, then contact them and say, I am going on a walk with the lions, because that is an activity that you'll be doing, and it's an activity that could increase your risk, and find out, yes, it's covered, no problem, it's in writing, and off you go. Or snow skiing. What are the restrictions? If I ski on black slopes versus a red slope, will the insurer cover both those type of slopes? On-piste skiing versus off-piste skiing. Generally, all policies will have a terrorism, war, and public disorder exclusion as well. If we now go into the main benefit, as I've mentioned, in my opinion, the main purpose of travel insurance, we've had to define infectious and contagious diseases on our side. And the reason for it is that if you look at, for instance, measles is also an infectious and contagious disease. But we're not going to treat measles in the same way that we are treating COVID-19. So for us, an infectious or contagious disease has now been defined to say that when the World Health Organization declares the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, then it will be treated as an infectious or contagious disease. So for example, if you do contract measles, it will then be just deemed as an unexpected illness, and it's still covered, and the cover limits are probably just higher because it's not declared by the World Health Organization as a pandemic typically. An illness, again, I think it's important for us to define that in travel insurance, but it has to meet specific criteria. And one of the criteria is that it requires immediate care. If you note that right at the beginning, I told you travel insurance is not a medical aid. So if it's something that can wait until you return to your home country, then you should not incur expenses for it. And I'm not saying put your life in danger, but I'm saying in general, if you've got a slight toothache, it's not too bad. You can live with it. You can wait till you're back in your country of permanent residence and then go and see the dentist. Obviously, if you're in such pain, excruciating pain, you can't eat, you need to go to the dentist whilst on your trip, then it will be covered. Pre-existing medical conditions. Again, each insurer has a different definition. Specifically, where I'm referring to the time period. So in our policy, we refer to 6 months. Some policies have 12 months. Some policies have, sorry, I have 3 months. So it's serious or chronic medical conditions for which you've either received medication, you consulted a doctor, you received treatment or surgery, or even you've shown symptoms and you're waiting for results of tests. You are on a waiting list for medical treatment, you received a terminal diagnosis, you're waiting for your medical results, and then if at any time you have your chronic conditions like heart conditions, hypertension, raised cholesterol, you've had a stroke in the past or an aneurysm, all of this will be deemed pre-existing medical conditions. And it's important that you declare them to your insurer and make sure that you do have cover should you travel. It's not impossible to get cover. We do cover. So for instance, if you're diabetic and your sugar levels have been stable and you don't have any other illness, for example, you don't have high blood pressure or high cholesterol, you only have diabetes, we will actually provide cover for diabetes. To continue on with overseas medical, on our insured perils, as we cover inpatient and outpatient treatment when it's authorized by us. Medical quarantine, as I've mentioned already with COVID-19. When you test positive, we will either pay for your inpatient treatment or for the hotel accommodation for the period up until 10 days whilst you are quarantined, as long as it's booked by us. So again, you need to check the conditions of cover. We will actually pay for the test, for example, of your COVID-19 test if you test positive. If you test negative, then unfortunately that will be deemed as elective or part of a travel requirement, and that won't be covered by your insurance policy. For pre-existing medical conditions, it depends on each insurer, but usually cover will be provided if you are treated as an inpatient for 2 days or more, 48 hours or more. And typically it's because we're not going to pay for you to get your chronic medication, or when it's not a serious treatment that you require due to a serious condition. So you physically have to be an inpatient for your pre-existing medical conditions cover. And then, as mentioned, we've got 101 sports on our side that we cover, as long as you're participating on a non-professional basis. If you are a ski instructor working in a snow resort, then you won't be covered if you are in a ski accident, because then you'll be deemed to be participating on a professional basis. If you are a professional athlete and you travel overseas to participate overseas in a competition, again, that is specific cover that those athletes have to get from typically Lloyd's of London, not a normal or a standard travel insurance policy. What do we pay for when it's authorized? So the treatment, the doctor's fees, your inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, ambulance charges to get you to the nearest hospital. And then we also have additional benefits to provide cover for, let's say you're traveling with your husband or your wife and you are an inpatient. What happens to that person? They want to return with you on the same flight when we actually do the repatriation, for example. And the same with visit by any one person. If you're traveling alone and you are in the hospital for 5 days or more, we will pay for the flight ticket of one person nominated by you to go through to that country where you are. We'll pay for the flight ticket and the accommodation. Again, it has to be authorized by us. If you are traveling with small children and you are incapacitated, we will then pay for the repatriation of the children. Depending on the age, we will also pay for an escort. Then we also pay for medical evacuation and medical repatriation. There's a difference between the two. Evacuation is where we take you to the nearest treating hospital. So it could be that you're in a remote location in Africa and you suffer from a heart attack. We will then airlift you. Let's say you are in Botswana. We might airlift you to Kenya or to South Africa, as those are the two countries in Africa where we know we've got two very, very strong cardio specialists to deal with heart attacks, etc. And then once you are stabilized, repatriation is where we say we're taking you back from that country back to your home country, depending on the medical advice and the fit to fly. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned with the example of the two clients that passed away last year, if you do pass away, the repatriation of your mortal remains. Important to understand that specifically in our environment, we've got a lot of what we call free cover or free policies through your bank. If you've paid for your airline ticket using your credit card, you've got free cover, or you've got your medical aid free cover. Medical aid's free cover won't cover you for the repatriation of mortal remains, because that's actually not deemed by medical aid as a medical benefit. You should have a funeral policy, for example, to cover that, but it is covered under travel insurance. So cancellation, just interesting when I was looking at the pictures for the birds, those are the two birds, I believe, the penguin and the ostrich that can't fly, and their flight has been cancelled. So now they're flightless again. So what is cancellation? Cancellation cover applies when you cancel, number one, important to note, and it's before you depart from your home country. Curtailment is where you cancel again, but you've already departed, you're on your trip, and now something happens and you need to go back to your home country earlier than your booked date. And then what do we pay? Typically, we will reimburse the published cancellation fees of the all the unused, non-refundable prepaid expenses for flights, accommodations, ski school fees, ski rentals, ski lift pass that you don't use because of the name Perils. The name Perils For cancellation, as you can see with the picture of that, again, I don't want to say which bird, but I have to assume it's a dove, and I hope I'm right, as unexpected illness, injury, or death. And then we get to the cancel for any reason. And that the cancel for named reasons, the unexpected illness, injury, or death, that's just an example. Each insurer will have a list of the named perils to say if you're retrenched by your employer, if there's damage to your house, unexpected illness, injury, or death, etc. And then they will say, okay, there's a cancel for any reason. And cancel for any reason is typically any reason that's not listed as a named peril. They will cover that. So, for example, if I want to travel and I notice that right now in the UK or in Europe, I was supposed to travel to Europe, but their infection rates for COVID is rising dramatically. And I feel nervous about it because I don't want to get stuck in a situation in a country that's unfamiliar with me, where the hospital facilities might be overburdened with the amount of patients. So therefore, I want to cancel my trip. So then I will claim under the cancel for any reason benefit because it's not listed as a named peril. As long as I've purchased my policy within 24 hours and I cancel my trip at least 48 hours before departure. Again, that will be very specific to the policy that you purchased to go and check the time limits. Important to understand that exclusions still apply. The example I gave you where I said I don't want to travel because there's a rise in infections, it's where I cancel my trip, I cancel my flight. Again, where the airline cancels the flight, that will not be covered under cancel for any reason because you didn't cancel your trip, the airline canceled your flight. However, there could be a scenario where the airline cancels your flight, but the accommodation provider that you were supposed to stay with, they're still open. It's just the airline that canceled the flight. So I've already mentioned you need to claim from the airline for your unused flight costs that they didn't provide transportation, but you could then submit a claim for the cancel for any reason for the accommodation. As long as you cancel your accommodation then with the accommodation provider at least 48 hours before you're supposed to depart from your home country. And that's almost me. I think just before we start with the question, the barn owl, which by the way is actually my favorite bird, to be honest. They can be found on every continent except, I'm sure most of you has got the answer, Antarctica. And then I've just got a couple of the questions that's been sent through already. Nikki and Keith, if you want me to just quickly go through them and then see if there's any additional questions.
Sure, yeah, we can work it that way, Uriah, no problem.
Okay, does travel insurance cover you if there's a pandemic? I think I've gone into a lot of the COVID-19 questions, but you need to also be able to separate medical versus cancellation. So medical, on our policy specifically, we are listing infectious and contagious diseases as a specific named peril. Again, we don't want a gray area where the client is unsure. If the policy that you are purchasing with whichever insurer you are purchasing it is not clear on that, you need to ask that question to say, what will you cover if I contract COVID whilst overseas? Do you pay for the test? Do you pay for if I have to be quarantined after I test positive in a hotel? Or will you only pay for inpatient treatment, etc.? So you have to be very specific in what you're asking for. On our policy, we do cover it, but you need to declare your pre-existing medical conditions to us because we also understand that there's certain comorbidities that's high risk for people that might contract COVID. And we're trying to manage our risk and exposure in that way. Is there a set cost of cancellation or interruption insurance? For example, a percentage of the travel package? I know that in the USA, when travel insurance is purchased, that the cancellation benefit is calculated as a percentage of your trip cost. So if your trip cost is $10,000, they could say a certain percentage is your premium for your cancellation cover. In South Africa, we don't actually base it on the percentage of your trip cost. It's part of an embedded, all the benefits included in it. Can I offer any insight about which travel insurance offerings to avoid? I think it's important, and again, I know we don't like to read the policy wording, but first of all, read the policy wording, and it's about your own personal need, to be quite honest. Does the policy suit your need, firstly? What's the name perils? What are the exclusions? Is there anything funny in the policy wording that you're not comfortable with? Then, how easy is it to contact the company? So when we have our policies, when they're issued, we provide our emergency assistance provider number. We also upfront give you details on how to contact our call center, if you've got any queries, etc. If you try and communicate with the company and you can't phone them or can't contact them, then you might want to reconsider, because if you're stuck overseas in a medical emergency, they need to answer you immediately when you phone them. So that for me is the most important that you need to look at. And then again, depending on which country you're traveling from, is this company registered in your country? Just because I can buy insurance online via the internet, it does not mean that you actually qualify or that you have legal protection should they reject your claim. So that's important to check as well.
Uriah, does Hollard cover US citizens, or is it only specific to certain regions?
So we cover on our inbound policies, we will provide cover for US citizens as long as they are traveling to South Africa and neighboring countries, or to Zambia. So Hollard has got a license in Zambia, Mozambique, Botswana, Namibia, and Ghana. So, and that's also underwritten by the Hollard license. So if they're traveling to that country, they can purchase inbound cover. As I've mentioned in the previous example, if a US citizen is traveling from the US to the UK, then unfortunately, they would need to look for cover from a provider in the US specifically. The advantage when US travelers travel to Africa, and they do travel to one of the countries that I've mentioned, and they purchase our cover, is that I do believe we've got a very strong understanding and expertise with Africa specifically. In dealing with remote locations. We had a snake bite also a year or two ago of a very well-known, prominent legal person that unfortunately passed away. They couldn't get the anti-venom to him quickly enough, but we deal with those situations. We understand the risks involved. Can insurance cover cancellations when your tour has already started? So then it will turn into a curtailment. If your tour has started, once you've departed from your home country, there is no longer cancellation cover, then it becomes curtailment, and curtailment is where you have to return to your home country earlier than booked. I hope that answers that question. And that's it from me, from the list of questions that I've just picked out some. I don't know if there's anything else you want me to answer.
Fantastic, thanks, Uriah. Yeah, there are quite a few questions that have come through on the Q&A.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and the chat side. So Nikki will get onto that with you pretty soon. Yeah, thank you so much for everyone who joined. If you would like to stay online, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, yeah, the webinar will be recorded. So if you do want to pick up any of the questions and the answers to those, you can always watch the recording later. That'll be released within the next 24 to 48 hours. Yeah, we had some fantastic feedback already. Thanks to everyone who's let us know what their thoughts about the webinar as well. Uriah, some folks saying this talk's just fantastic, good information. Glad I took time to watch. This is the best webinar I've ever heard on the topic of travel insurance. Well done, Uriah is amazing. Thank you. So
oh, wow.
Thanks for making travel insurance interesting, fun, and informative. Who would have guessed?
I am so happy to get that feedback. Thank you so much, because I always think this is going to be so boring and people are not going to want to listen. So thank you.
Oh, wonderful. No, thank you, Uriah. It's been great. So just before we get stuck into Q&A quickly, I just wanted to take the opportunity to let you know about next week's webinar. Very excited. Next week's actually going to be a milestone webinar for us. It's going to be our 20th webinar in the Dream Destination series. We're venturing off to the fascinating country of Japan with Stu Elsom, and he's going to give us a wonderful perspective of Japan. It's really famous. Dancing cranes, Blakiston's fish owl, Seller's sea eagle, some classic birding names, some household names of species that everyone dreams about seeing, and spectacular scenery obviously as well, especially in the winter time. Spring is also fabulous as well. But yeah, it's going to be a fabulous webinar with Stu, and he's going to be taking us right across Japan, all the way from the northern part, the northern island of Hokkaido, right down into the tropical islands of Okinawa and Amami as well. And then just finally wanted to take the opportunity to let you all know that tomorrow and Friday will be your last chance to register for Global Birding Weekend, which is taking place on the 17th and 18th of October. If you think you might have a few free hours over the weekend and wish to go birding, it's a wonderful event to get involved with, and it's all tied in with eBird as well. Very easy to sign up. So if you would like to join Team Rock Jumper on the day, we would love to have you on board. And for more information on how to sign up, please just email us at info@rockjumper.com. There are prizes up for grabs as well, and you could even find yourself winning a cruise for 2 on the special Flock to Marion trip with BirdLife South Africa and Rock Jumper. But yeah, that's enough from me. Over to you, Nikki.
Oh, thanks. And you know, insurance obviously differs from country to country and from the different insurance providers. So always, I think my biggest takeaway is read your T's and C's and the fine details. It's so important. Peter here, he said, you stated airline operational delays are not covered as the airline is responsible. Any contract of carriage I've looked at absolves the airline for any responsibility, at least in the US for this. Are you saying no insurance carrier will cover operational delays?
I think I need to also differentiate and just clarify that there's the European Union travelers' rights, where airlines actually have a legal liability. They can't shy away from it. If they've caused a delay, etc., they're forced to pay travelers. So if you are traveling from the US to a European destination or on a European airline, they have to reimburse you. Travel within the United States, depending on the contract, the airline could or may well have it in their conditions of contract to say that they're not covering it. But from a travel insurance point of view, operational cause delays is an uninsurable risk. And I don't know of many travel insurers. There could be. Again, you just need to check with the companies that you might be dealing with, whether they specifically cover operational reasons. But we deem it to be an uninsurable risk, because imagine if we say that we cover operational risks, then airlines don't have to worry to get their crew to the aircraft on time, because we're just going to pay. You know, so that's something in their control that they need to make sure happens timeously. And therefore we cover adverse weather or mechanical breakdown.
Oh, great.
I hope that answers.
Another question here is, because of COVID, I'm planning trips far in advance and tour groups are offering substantial flexibility. For example, a relatively small deposit confirms my spot in a trip and it's 100% refundable in many months' time. I might not need to pay the balance for almost a year after I make the deposit. Why should I buy travel insurance within 24 hours of making the deposit if the policy may be more than the deposit at that stage? So why not wait until I pay the actual cost of the trip and buy the insurance then? And I suppose, again, it depends on your insurance provider and just knowing exactly, you know, ask them that question, when should I pay? But from Hollard's perspective?
I think that's a very good question. I think we need to clarify as well as whatever the provider says is their flexibility. Is their flexibility only relating to COVID-related situations where they are perhaps saying, and even myself personally, I've told Nikki I'm planning a trip to Mauritius in December. So I'm really hoping and praying, even being in travel insurance, that it will happen. But my tickets as well has a certain amount of flexibility in them. And that's great that the providers are actually now coming to the party. They're obviously trying to boost, you know, travelers' confidence again. And they're saying that they'll allow changes. If the changes is a blanket change that they'll allow, so whether it's due to illness or injury or they can't fly or COVID, etc., then great. Then obviously you don't need to buy your insurance within 24 hours. Keep in mind that the main purpose of travel insurance is still related to medical cover. So at least make sure you buy the insurance before you depart.
Yeah. Vernon says here, travel insurance for an expedition like Antarctic, trip interruption and cost pro rata per day. The company said that being on the ship is an important part of the trip. So you have the lounging on the deck in the sun and eating all day at the buffets. All we got out of the trip was 4 days of gale winds and never made a landing and saw ice before evacuation due to illness. Should we get total trip cost back or only 1/3 of the 12-day trip cost? How can we be smarter next time?
So I almost thought Vernon was going to brag about his trip, and then it turned bad. So sorry that it wasn't that nice. Nikki, just to clarify, did he not complete the trip due to the illness?
Yes, it looks like he had evacuation due to illness.
Yeah, so in curtailment, how we generally calculate that would be the unused portion. So if your trip was booked for 10 days and you were on the ship for 3 days and then you got off because of the illness, we will reimburse you for the 7 days that you didn't use. I understand that the 3 days was a horrible experience in terms of the wind and illness, but lack of enjoyment is unfortunately, again, that's an uninsurable risk. The fact that you were on the ship, you can't claim that portion. You can actually just claim for the unused portion.
Thank you so much. If a victim, Steve's saying, if a victim of if you're a victim of a criminal act by someone, is that covered, or is it excluded?
So no, definitely. If you are not the criminal, so the exclusion is where I, the traveler, commit a criminal act. So I steal, for example. So to give an example, we had a client that traveled to Thailand, and he had a foreign exchange currency with him, US dollars. I don't know how many people know this. I didn't know this up until a couple of years ago, but actually every time after you return to your country of residence, you're supposed to exchange your foreign currency back to local currency. Because what I did in the past is if I had a couple of dollars left, I would keep them for my next trip because then I don't have to exchange again. So he did something similar to that. He had foreign exchange left over from a previous trip a couple of years ago, went to Thailand, and the day he wanted to check out of his hotel, and he wanted to pay with the foreign exchange, it got flagged because the US actually withdrew those serial numbers. And it wasn't actually legal tender anymore. And he got arrested for trying to use, in their opinion, fake money. And we actually covered him because that was not an intentional criminal act. We got him legal representation. And to make a long story short, his passport was returned and he could finally leave Thailand. But that was not an intentional criminal act. Where it is something where you on purpose or intentionally commit a criminal act, the policy won't cover you. But if somebody else also, if they commit a criminal act against you, so if you get assaulted or, for example, they steal your baggage, that is definitely covered under the policy.
Oh, thanks. Marcia is saying, I buy a yearly travel insurance because I travel a lot. Any pitfalls that I should know about? Do I need to let them know when I do travel? I don't remember any instructions to that effect, but maybe I missed the small print.
A multi-trip policy is a great policy to have if you're a frequent traveler and you don't want to have to go through the effort of having to buy travel insurance every time. Typically, a multi-trip policy will not cover cancel for any reason. But again, she would need to check that with her insurer, whether that's included in the benefit. And if that's not important to her, then that's fine. Again, it's for each person's needs. A lot of the multi-trip policies will limit, so you can travel unlimited amounts of time during a year, but it will limit you up to how many days per trip. So on our policies, for example, we will limit you up to 45 days per trip, but you can go as many times as you want. The most important part is if you've had any changes in your health after you've purchased your policy, but before your next trip, is to declare that to your insurer, just to make sure that the cover continues.
Oh, thank you. Brendan says some insurers seem to put a cap on claims for accommodation travel costs, which are well below the cost of some trips, which can now be around, 150,000 Rand or $20,000. Why is that, and how do you get insurance to cover the full cost of the trip?
So our policies, we would typically have under our normal standard policies, we'll provide cover up to, for example, 60,000 Rand per person, per adult. But it can be increased, and again, then we would want to do some underwriting up front. But keep in mind, where I've mentioned in the beginning that insurance is dependent on the frequency, but also how high the premium will be. So we're not, the product that we have designed almost as our standard product for most of the travelers, 60,000 would be adequate cover. If we had to increase that, we can increase it some, but it will be at an additional premium, so it can be done. But if you are going to look at really high costs of, let's say, 200,000 per person for doing a very specialized top-of-the-range trip, the cost of the premium, we can never recover that should there be a cancellation. And then it affects the rest of the policy holders, because ultimately the more claims we get, the more it means we have to increase our premiums, and not maybe immediately, but in a year's time, when somebody looks at our policies again, they'll say, oh, but now there's been a serious premium increase. It's because our claims were too high. So we try and keep that balance, and that's why it's unfortunately not unlimited cover, and it depends on each insurer as to what their appetite is in terms of cancellation, the sum insured that they'll provide.
Marcia asks quite an interesting one here. What if you are in a country and the country changes its requirements or conflict breaks out and you have to leave? Is that covered?
Under our leisure policies, so that would typically be security evacuation. We provide cover for security evacuation when you purchase a corporate policy for us. I didn't really touch on the corporate policies, but that would be a company that will buy a certain amount of days for employees traveling on their behalf. So, then we would pay for them to actually get, and usually when something like that happens, the flights are limited to get you out. I think it's also important to understand that a travel insurance company is not a rescue company. There are rescue companies that specialize in rescuing people all across the world, and you will pay them for those services. Travel insurance is not a rescue company. If a flight cannot land in a country, we cannot get you out of that country. Yeah. We cannot charter a flight to get you out of that country if the government says no aircraft is allowed to land, etc. So we can only do as much as we can in terms of what is commercially viable and available. Yeah. Your policy will continue. So let's say there's civil unrest and you get injured as you were walking through the streets and there were unexpected civil unrest. Your policy covers you for that because that was unexpected. Just don't travel to a country where it's been announced up front, and try and get out of the country as soon as you can. But you are covered for medical expenses should anything happen to you due to whatever has changed overnight.
I've got one more question for you, Uriah. Thank you so much. You've been a fountain of information. If you have blood pressure controlled while by medication, do you have a pre-existing condition of high blood pressure?
Yes, you still have a pre-existing condition. However, for example, in our case, we have to find, we've got a form where we've actually, and I've tried to touch on pre-existing conditions, but it's a lot more complicated. But on our form, we've got 3 groups. Group 1 is where you've got a pre-existing condition. You don't actually have to declare it to us. It's automatically covered. Group 2 is where you, sorry, I have to now remember the groups. Okay, so the next group, let me not confuse it, is where you have an existing condition, but we deem it to be an uninsurable risk. For example, if you've got a terminal prognosis, that will be an uninsurable risk, and we cannot provide cover if you travel for that condition. So no matter, even if you declare that condition, we can't cover it. And then the next group would be, well, it's not in group 1 where we list what we cover, and it's not in the next group where we list what we don't cover. It's in between. Then you have to declare those to us so that we can then give you a formal response. But to give you a short answer, if you only have high blood pressure, It is a pre-existing condition, but it's under group 1, where we actually deem it not to be high risk as long as it's controlled well. If you have high blood pressure and another like high cholesterol or diabetes, there's a combination now between those, then you actually do move into the high risk category.
Very, very interesting. And, you know, it's so important before you travel, look at getting the right travel insurance, making sure you check your T's and C's, make sure you've got an evacuation product that's with that as well, because that's an add-on that's very important. And now I know just within Rock Jumper, we're looking at extra extended T's and C's now, where there's an additional product that can cover you for certain conditions within COVID-19. And we're likely going to be, this will be live from 1st November. So, you know, some of the things would be if you or someone within your immediate household have contracted COVID-19 within 14 days immediately prior to booking, supported by evidence of a COVID, you know, positive test, you can get your full refund. So another one would be hospitalization or death of you or of your immediate family. It's that that extra protection. So just see what kind of add-ons are available, and you know, insurance is one thing that it's hard and expensive to pay up front, but it's really needed when you're sitting in those difficult situations. But thank you so much, Uriah. I really appreciate all your assistance, and yeah, that's all the questions. If we've missed any questions from anyone, please email us on info@rockjumper.com. We're not the travel insurance experts, but we will send your question on to Uriah. Thank you for joining us today. From Team Rock Jumper, we say enjoy the rest of your day and see you for Japan next week. Cheers, guys. Bye.
See you. Bye, everyone.